The following are two stories about deathbed scenes. Dorothy Miller. Australian nurse Dorothy had been working for 40 years in intensive care, but in 1986 found one of the toughest jobs was to nurse her husband Ted, who was suffering from inoperable cancer. Although he'd been in and out of hospital on many occasions, towards what they believed was the last weeks of his life, he chose to be at home, rather than in palliative care in some strange environment. Whilst Dorothy was caring for her husband, she was encountering some strange events, and the first one happened on July the 20th. While Ted was in bed and Dorothy was regularly going in and out of the room, both day and night, at 2 a.m. in the morning, she went in to check on his welfare, and she noticed that his head and shoulders were surrounded by a large circle of light. She said that it looked like moonlight, but wasn't actually touching him, and it looked like an aura. It looked to be about 1 meter across and went from one side of the single bed to the other. It looked milky white and fuzzy around the edges. In all of the years she'd been nursing, Dorothy had never encountered anything like it. She went across to her husband to check his pulse and found that his hands were freezing cold. She figured he was in his last stages of life, as there was no way that he should be that cold, as he was wearing sheepskin boots and was lying on a sheepskin rug. She was not able to ask how he was feeling, as he was in a semi-conscious state. Dorothy tried to work out where the strange light was coming from that was enveloping her husband, and checked the heavy curtains, but they were securely closed, so no light was coming through from outside. The bedroom door was closed, and there were no mirrors in the room that could have reflected any light into the room from outside. The only light in the room came from a small lamp, which she said she had put behind a partially closed wardrobe so that it wouldn't shine in his eyes. The light from the lamp could not have caused the aura that surrounded her husband. She gave up looking for the source of the light and just sat with her husband until 5 a.m. in the morning. She then walked out into the kitchen to make a cup of coffee, and when she returned, the light surrounding her husband had vanished. She then checked her husband's pulse. To her surprise, found that he was now extremely warm. His breathing was no longer laboured, and he was sleeping peacefully. It appeared that he'd made a partial and temporary recovery. Dorothy had never seen anything like it in her life. He recovered well enough for them to discuss her future in the event of his passing, but he also disclosed that while they were talking, he could see 3 other people in the room. He was not in the least bit delirious and was lucid in his thinking, and then described the 3 people in the room with them. One of them was an old army mate, and another was a brother-in-law who had been particularly fond of, and the third was a woman he did not know. The strange woman was dressed in a black outfit. The 2 men had died many years before, and it was at this stage that he suddenly recognised the woman as his mother, who had died when he was very young, so he had not known her very well. According to her husband, the 3 people remained in the room for the next 2 weeks, and when his daughter came for a visit, he asked her whether she could see them, but she couldn't. Ted died on the night of the 24th of September 1986, and Dorothy stayed with him till about 6 a.m. She claimed that from the moment he died, she felt his presence in the room with her, and the room remained warm. But when the room suddenly became very cold, she knew that he had moved on. She was now in the room by herself. Bill John. In 1981, when Bill was 70 years of age, he started getting chest pains, but this was not the first time he'd experienced them. Normally he would lay down until they passed, but on this occasion they got worse, so they called for an ambulance. Within half an hour, he was hooked up to an electrocardiogram at the North Shore Hospital in Sydney. Whilst Bill was lying down and looking at the ceiling, the acoustic tiles started to waver and looked as if they were floating on water. Bill immediately thought that it was the end, and said he was not afraid but rather curious, and was waiting for the transition from this life to the next. Bill claims that at this stage he was not on any medication of any kind. Bill then found himself in what looked like a pastel-coloured square room, about 3.5 metres high, with sides about 8 metres long. He sensed there was another wall about 1 metre behind him. He couldn't tell whether the wall in front of him was solid or a space that stretched into infinity. The wall was vertical drapes, and each drape was about 1 metre wide and hung from floor to ceiling. The drapes appeared to vibrate as if a fan was blowing on them. All of the drapes were coloured a light pink at the top and became darker pink at the bottom. The lighting looked normal, but came from an unknown source. He then saw people, but only their heads and shoulders were visible. They were in 2s and 3s, and just peered at him around the drapes. He immediately recognised them, especially his late mother, who was in the centre of the groups. He then saw many friends, as well as childhood acquaintances. They were all people he had loved and known during his childhood, but what stood out most was their expressions. Their faces showed extreme happiness, interest, and expectations. They seemed overjoyed at his presence. Bill said he wanted to move towards his mother, but was somehow unable to do so. Suddenly, 3 men in business suits appeared out of nowhere like a mass of shimmering snowflakes, rapidly increasing in size and density until they became solid. They stood in line, and then various isolated events in his life were mentally presented to him. The images were in full colour and 3-dimensional. Each of the events ended with the decision he had made, and the action he had taken, and the effect it had made on the people concerned. It was both impressive and frightening. The 3 figures then slowly faded away in the same shimmering light that they had appeared. He again tried to move towards his mother without success. At this stage, he was not thinking of himself, but his wife Gwyneth, who was still alive. Then all of a sudden, everything was brought to a sudden and painful halt by a blow to the back of his head. He then felt angry about being brought back to the world and screamed out, "No!" and again tried to approach his mother. He then felt another blow to the back of his head and he screamed, "Don't!" The ceiling above him then returned to normal and he realised he was back. Bill was disappointed, shattered and resentful that he had been brought back. 10 days later, he was discharged from hospital with a new attitude and realised that it was not yet his time to go, but had refused triple bypass surgery. After that experience, he claims that he'd lost his fear of dying, but was upset that his friends were not interested in his experience, and that there was possibly an afterlife.